Hello, my name is Russ Galvin, and I'm with Colorado Crane Operator School, and I want to talk to you a little bit today about crane awareness on the job site. So, whenever a crane pulls up on the job site, there's a few things that you want to make sure and just see in general during the hoisting operations that everything's being performed in a safe and efficient manner. Don't always take it for granted that the operator is always going to be following the right rules, or if not, the lift director, which is the person in charge of lifting operation, is doing everything properly. So just don't always make that assumption. What we're getting ready to just talk here about is just some general, about 6 or 7 different items that just kind of keep your eye on during the hoisting operations. So that way you can make sure everything is running in a safe and efficient manner. So the first one we're really talking about is going to be crane overload. With that being said, you really want to pay attention to, outriggers coming off the ground, or the crawler tracks coming off the ground. It's a crane tilting to a certain degree, just as general overload, because what some people still believe nowadays, even though it's 2020, that cranes will just tip over before they break. That's kind of like that old school mindset where cranes nowadays, the more designed, they're going to have that structural chart where the boom is going to buckle before necessarily that crane's going to tip over. So if you start to see those instances, where the outrigger starts to come off the ground a little bit, or those tracks start to lift up off the ground, that crane is having an overload event at that point, which is more likely exceeding the crane's capacity at that point in time. So, if you start to see that, you definitely want to go ahead and raise that awareness to the crane operator and the lift director to the hoisting operations to make sure they can verify the weight of that load and that's appropriate for the crane's radius. Another thing you want to pay attention to during the lifting operation is going to be power lines and just obstructions. So, OSHA has the regulations, how close a crane during hoisting operations, how close a crane can be, around power lines. And it's really based off the voltage of the power lines itself. As a general rule, if the kilovolts are 350 kilovolts or less, you want to stay 20 feet away. If they're more than 50 or 350 kilovolts, you want to stay 50 feet away. There are certain exclusions, meaning that certain ways that you can get a little bit closer, whether you're using table A, you're using you're doing work under subpart V. But once again, those individuals around the crane, that are using the crane, they should be very familiar with that type of work. But, and you're more than welcome to go ahead and hop on OSHA.gov, look at the exact rules when it comes to table A and the rules or the steps that they need to take, I should say, to make sure they're using the hoisting operations in a safe and efficient manner. The other thing too is just general obstructions. Just by the nature of themselves, construction job sites are very dynamic. Meaning some part of the building that wasn't there in the morning has been erected later on during the day, or an aerial lift that wasn't there in the morning has moved in, later on part of the day. So as the lifting operations take place throughout the day, you really want to make sure that the crane operator is fully aware of all those obstructions around the job site so they can understand what's going on. Because, if a crane is really only operating in a 180 degree radius, if they're only picking one thing on the left, swinging over to the right, and everything's happening behind them, they may not necessarily be aware of it until they they still start to swing over to grab something, that's on that opposite side. So that's where you want to make sure the operator is aware of any obstructions during the hoisting activities that may present themselves throughout the day. Another just general crane awareness we want to pay attention to will be trenches and excavations. There is a general rule of thumb, for every 1 foot down, you want to be 1 foot away from that trench. But, that's just a general rule of thumb, and it's not something that you really want to hang your hat on, because soil type conditions, saturation in terms of weather and water can definitely affect, that as well. So you really want to make sure that, the crane operator is fully aware, and, proper setup definitely plays a part. Weather plays a part. All that soil type plays a part. So that's why you really want to make sure you contact that qualified individual during that crane setup. And then, of course, the crane operator should already been notified of any potential tanks and voids during the, before they actually go to set up, so that we don't set that outrigger over a void and then all of a sudden they start to lift over that outrigger, and that outrigger just collapse that void, and obviously the crane would tip over in that instance potentially. So those are some general things to be aware of in that. Another thing too will be just structural damage to the crane itself. And that should already be covered through the natural inspection process of the cranes. So meaning that every crane needs to have a shift inspection that is performed by a competent person, by the end of that shift. There also should be a monthly inspection, and there needs to be records of 3 months of that monthly inspection on that crane at all times, which is really not a whole lot more than that shift inspection, but has been documented now. And then the crane needs to have an annual inspection as well. That annual inspection, and the difference between that annual inspection and that monthly inspection is, of course, the annual is a lot more in depth. There's a few things we definitely need to look more into, but it's actually performed by a qualified individual, so that's someone that is experienced in crane inspections, so that way they can go through and document anything in excessive wear, or, potential safety hazards, and that's potentially, on record, on file, and that should be with the crane at all times. And one other inspection that a lot of people aren't fully aware of is just, every crane needs to have that post-assembly inspection by a qualified person, whether it be you're adding another boom section, you're installing a jib onto a crane, even a telescopic crane, you're swinging that jib on, that's adding a component to that crane. So a qualified individual needs to make sure that that process has been documented and observed by a qualified individual. Another just general crane awareness as you kind of go through this will be the rigging, right? Make sure that all the rigging being used for the crane is up to date, has met all the according OSHA and ASME standards. Everything has been documented, or everything has been inspected, and you're using the appropriate rigging for the appropriate job. So all that, just some general awareness, quick consultation. Because one thing too, with that being said, is during hoisting operations, there should be a qualified rigger, should also be a qualified signal person, and of course the operator does need to be certified. So don't take it necessarily for granted that all three of those individuals have met all the OSHA standards for the hoisting operations. So that's something to just be able to get some documentation of, make sure those individuals are, they have records of each one of those, and they've had the appropriate training. Another thing too to pay attention to will be crane modifications. You don't necessarily see it nearly as much nowadays, but it still happens. But if a crane shows up and they have a homemade jib, for lack of better terms, because it fits this type of application that they've done in the past, and then just as a general rule of thumb, any modifications made to a crane needs to be approved by the manufacturer or a registered professional engineer that has experience to that piece of equipment. So, and of course, once again, records need to be maintained for that entire process. And just another thing too, during crane safety, just general awareness, make sure that crane is operating in a level fashion, right? Make sure the crane is level. The ground doesn't have to necessarily be level if it's going to be on a crane that runs off outriggers, because those outriggers are able to get that crane level, that superstructure level where it needs to be. But once again, if you're operating a crane on crawlers, has crawler tracks, then that ground, obviously, the levelness of the ground does play a huge importance factor. So, but at the end of the day, that crane needs to be within 1% level during hoisting operations, because even swinging from a high side to a low side is going to increase your radius on that crane. And whenever you increase that radius on that crane, it decreases your capacity of that crane in a general fashion. So it's definitely something you want to pay attention to. And then finally, just the hoisting operations of itself, making sure those hoist lines are always vertical. So not only vertical being side to side, but obviously vertical, in terms to boom drift in and out, because if that load starts to come up in a non-vertical fashion, so which introduces maybe a level of side loading, it's actually twisting that boom a little bit. So therefore, it's actually decreasing the structural integrity of that boom structure. So there's a few things you want to pay attention to. And then, boom drift, that boom tip is over the top of that load as it starts to come up, that load will actually drift out away from that boom, therefore increasing that radius and increasing the risk for potential tip over or structural damage. So, I mean, all these are just a handful of things you want to pay attention to during crane safety and crane awareness. Just a general rule of thumb, you want to make sure all these things are being observed and everyone is qualified or certified accordingly, because meaning that every crane operator during construction activities needs to be fully certified for their crane type. And also, something people don't realize too is that crane operator needs to have an evaluation performed by the owner of that crane, the company that they work for, to make sure they are actually competent and able to run that particular crane type. That's another part of that regulation that a lot of people are not fully aware of. But during those hoisting operations, you really want to make sure that everything runs smoothly, because at the end of the day, everybody wants to have a very safe and efficient job site, because not only accident that happens on the job site and around the crane world, not only does it affect the crane and those individuals, but it actually does affect the entire job site. So crane safety in general is not only their responsibility, but it's everyone's responsibility during the hoisting operations. All right, so this is once again, this is Russ Galvin, Colorado Crane Operator School. Hope you have a fabulous day.